You're watching Study with Sudhir and you're watching this story, A Gorilla in the Guest Room, which is part of the ISC English Literature. I hope you have seen explanation video number 1, in which we introduced you the basic theme of this particular story. Very delightful and a witty story. Also introduced you to the character of Npongo, the 2-year-old baby gorilla. Now let's proceed with the second part of the story. Now within 12 months, that is when by the time he was 3 years old, Npongo had almost doubled his size. And this is something which you should know about the physical characteristics of a gorilla. And it was now time to try by fair means or foul to obtain a mate for him. Unless they lack finances, I have no use for zoos that acquire animals. Now this is the second comment that he is making about how zoos should be and what is the kind of role they should ideally play. So he says, Gerald Durrell says that unless they lack finances, he says zoos should not acquire animals only for exhibition purposes and make no effort to provide them with a mate. You know, the whole thing of that empathy that he has for animals, and he believes that they should also lead a proper kind of a life, and he says this applies particularly to apes. The problem does not arise while they are young, for they accept the human beings around them as their adopted, if slightly eccentric family. Again, a sense of humor, almost making fun of the human race itself, because the human beings are the ones who are in direct contact with the apes, the ones at the zoo. Then comes a time when they are so powerful that you do not, if you have any intelligence, treat them in the same intimate way, because you can get hurt, because the gorillas are obviously very strong, heavy, powerful, and they can actually hurt you if they start playing with you in the same intimate manner as they did when they were much younger and obviously much lighter. When a gorilla or a chimpanzee or an orangutan at the age of 3 or 4 pulls your legs under you or jumps from a considerable height onto the back of your neck, it tests your stamina to the full and is done because you're the only companion with who he can play. If he is left on his own and is a nice-natured ape, he will try to play the same games with you when he is 11 or 12. This means a broken leg or a broken neck. So the kind of physical harm that he can cause you unknowingly, and obviously he doesn't wish to do that. So this friendly, exuberant animal is kept on his own and deprived of both the company of his own kind and that of human beings. You can hardly be surprised if he turns into a morose and melancholy creature. Morose as in somebody who is a very irritable kind of a person. Not wanting to. Now, Gerald Durrell doesn't want Npongo to degenerate into one of those magnificent but sad and lonely anthropoids that I have seen in many zoos, including some that had ample resources for providing a mate. So he believes that there were zoos which actually could have done so, but they did not do that. I thought the time had come to try to procure a wife for Npongo, even though I knew that our funds would probably not stretch that far. So he says he did not have the access to those kind of funds, but he believed that the time had come to acquire a wife for Npongo, because the first one to acquire Npongo, he had to spend 1,200 pounds. He would have had to dish out a similar amount in order to acquire a wife for Npongo as well. And that's the time when he telephoned the dealer from whom he had got Npongo, and he tells him that not really, Npongo, a female gorilla is not available, and the price had increased because of the political situation in Africa, and he was now asking for 1,500 pounds, 1,500 pounds, and after 2 days of trying to get another female gorilla, he called up the dealer and he said, would he be able to kind of provide the animal on installment basis? That is, you provide the female gorilla, but I would pay the money in installments, and he actually agreed. The bank manager had reacted in the same negative manner, and that had led to an acrimonious, that is a slightly heated kind of a conversation with the bank manager, and he put up a collection box out there saying that we have bought Nandi, that is the female gorilla, on the installment plan. Please help us to keep up the installments. That is, he was trying to do crowdfunding, trying to elicit contributions in order to pay for the 1,500 pounds. And she arrived crouched in a crate, and now you will need to know the difference between Nandi and Npongo. Both of them have come as baby gorillas, but look at the difference between the two gorillas, the male and the female. Now, she, like Npongo, appeared to be in perfect condition. Her fur was glossy, she was fat, and her skin had a sheen like satin. But at first sight of her, it was her eyes that impressed me the most. And there is a difference, because Npongo's eyes were small and deep set, calculating and full of humor. But Nandi's eyes were large. She had bigger eyes and lustrous, and when she looked sideways, she showed the whites of them. But they were frightened eyes that did not look at you squarely. So, unlike Npongo, who was much more full of confidence, Nandi was a little more timid in nature, and she looked at you with slightly frightened kind of an expression. They were the eyes of an animal that had little experience. So there was a sense of you were kind of apprehensive of how this human being, an unknown kind of a commodity, is likely to behave. But even that limited experience had given her no reason to trust or respect them. So while Npongo was much more trusting of human beings, Nandi was not so. When we released her from the cage, I could see the reason. Right across the top of her skull was a scar which must have measured 6 or 7 inches in length. So she had suffered some kind of an injury which could have been because of the experience with some human being, and that could have been while she was being caught. Some over-enthusiastic and intrepid human being had given her a blow with a machete, as in a sharp weapon, which had split her scalp like a razor slash. It must have been a glancing blow, or her skull would have been split in two. So it would have been a very deep injury, but it had left this large scar, and that must have been the reason for her behavior and her apprehension towards human beings. Okay. With such an introduction to the human race, you could hardly blame Nandi for being a little antisocial, unlike Npongo. This great slash was now by completely healed, and there was only the long white scar to be seen through the hair of her head, which reminded me of the curious, imitative and quite unnecessary partings that so many Africans carve in their hair with the aid of a razor. The hairstyle that Africans do, so he's kind of making an oblique and not a very positive kind of a reference to them. We kept Nandi in a separate cage for 24 hours so that she could settle down. The cage was next to Npongo's to enable her to see her future husband, but she evinced as little interest in him as she evinced in us. So her reaction even to a mate was not very positive. If you tried to talk to her and look directly at her eyes would slide from side to side, meeting yours only for a sufficient length of time to judge what your next action might be. So she is kind of very cautious in her approach. She's keeping an eye, but only the eye contact is only for the limited purpose of seeing whether you are not attempting anything which is a little confrontationist or anything which is a little aggressive. Eventually deciding that the wire between herself and us rendered us comparatively harmless, and preferring not to look at us, she did turn her back. She had such a woe-begone, frightened face. Now, woe-begone essentially is referring to something, again, being very, very sad. Okay. That one longed to pick her up and comfort her, but she had been too deeply hurt, and this was the last thing she would have appreciated. Okay. Then comes the morning when she is let into the cage where Npongo also is. And they are very clear that it would take us about 6 months for us to gain the confidence of this female gorilla. And that was a red letter day, because they were all very anxious as to how it would really pan out. Npongo had now become such a fearfully extroverted character. He was not an introvert. He was a very friendly, and he would do everything very jolly kind of an attitude. And he obviously considered that he was the only gorilla in the world and all human beings were his friends. So in that sense, this was a new addition to his circle. We did not know how he would react to Nandi's sullenness and anti-human attitude. Although for 24 hours, he could see her in the cage alongside him, he had shown absolutely no interest in her presence. Okay, thus by the time the introduction came, we stood with buckets of water in case it was a violent kind of an interaction. So they stood with buckets of water, brushes, nets, long sticks, just in case the engagement party did not come off with the same romantic swing that one expects from reading women's magazines. Okay, again, wit and humor. Now, when all was ready, we opened the shutters, and Nandi, looking thoroughly distrustful, sidled her way into the cage from into Npongo's comparatively palatial quarters. So he has a large kind of an enclosure, right? But again, the two of them don't kind of look at each other or mingle with each other immediately. Her eyes darting to and fro from a curiously suspicious yet belligerent expression on her face. So she's sometimes aggressive, sometimes very, very curious and suspicious and watchful in her approach. Now that she was actually in the cage with Npongo, who was sitting up on a branch watching her with the same expression of uninterested mistrust that he had reserved for some new item of diet, we could see that she was only about half his size, when you could actually make a comparison between how big he was and how small she was. And then came the critical moment. The two gorillas and ourselves were frozen into immobility. Then Npongo stretched out a black hand with fingers like great sausages, clasped a wire and rolled himself carefully to the ground. There he paused and examined a handful of sawdust which was there inside the enclosure, as though it was the first time that he'd ever come across such a commodity. So it's almost like, talking about him as though he was a young human being. And then he kind of gripped a handful of her hair and pulled it, then hurried along the perimeter of the cage as though nothing had happened. So he was teasing her. And he's an extrovertish kind of a character. Nandi is little slow in the uptake, and so Npongo was some 6 feet before she realized what he had actually done. By then, the baring of her teeth, which shows a sense of anger, and her grunt of indignation, of anger and annoyance, were quite useless because he was already 6 feet away from her. So these are all important instances because we human beings also tend to behave the same way. So if you get a question as to how the two are actually similar, human beings and gorillas, you need to pick out all these kind of instances, and that's what the writing style essentially has done. So far what we have come to know is the power equation between the two gorillas, right? And that's what is interesting in the way he has written it. So the first round, he says, almost as though it was a boxing bout, had gone to Npongo, but before he could get exalted views of male superiority, I felt that we should bring up the second line of defense. We removed the buckets and nets and produced 2 large dishes full of a succulent selection of fruits. So a large collection of fruits was placed before the two gorillas. One was presented to Npongo and one to Nandi. There is a slight moment of tension when Npongo, having examined his own plate, decided that possibly Nandi's contained additional delicacies which his lacked, and went off to investigate, just like human beings do. Nandi, still smarting under the indignity of having her hair pulled, greeted Npongo's investigation of her plate with such a display of belligerence. She did not approve of what Npongo was trying to do. Then Npongo, being essentially a good-humored and cowardly creature, retreated to his own pile of food. For the next half hour, they ate their own plates that night, and then begins their friendship, romance, that they begin to kind of start sharing their quarters, their enclosure, right? That who would occupy what position. Should Npongo be allowed to pinch Nandi's carrots even though they were smaller than his own? Okay, it had the childishness of a general election, but it was 3 times as interesting. So look at the description. Please make note of these kind of sentences. And judging by the way Npongo snuggled up to her, okay, he was not at all averse to this invasion of his bedroom, that he allowed the female gorilla to come and share his sleeping space. It was quite obvious that they plainly adored one another. Npongo was the great giggling clown of the pair, that he was, as it's already been explained, he was an extrovert, he was used to doing a lot of things, while Nandi was much quieter, more introspective and watchful. Npongo was the bullying and the teasing kind of person. Okay, and his good humor teasing would drive her to distraction. It must have been rather like married to a professional practical joker. So that's how he is described by Gerald Dural. When she reached the limit of her endurance, she would lose her temper and with flashing eyes and open mouth would chase him round the cage while he ran before her, giggling hysterically. If she caught him, she would belabor him with her fist while Npongo lay on the ground curled up in a ball. Nandi might as well have tried to hurt a lump of cement in spite of her strength, for he would just lie there laughing to himself, his eyes shining with good humor. So it shows how the two animals, the two gorillas, actually play act with each other. Okay, and Npongo would sit up, brush the sawdust from himself, beat a rapid tattoo of triumph on his breast or stomach, the way gorillas used to do. You must have seen it in movies. And then he would sit with his arms folded, his eyes glittering, working out some trick to annoy his wife. Okay, so that shows the relationship, and those are some of the questions which come. One question which could come would be the narrator's relationship with Npongo. The other question that could come would be the relationship, how it is forged between the two gorillas, Npongo and Nandi. Okay, and then started the problems, because Npongo becomes sick, and there was a sense of anxiety over his state of health. His nose, and one of them got sawdust up his nose and sneezed, and we viewed this with alarm and despondency. Was this a prelude to pneumonia or something worse? The functioning of their bowels was a constant a topic of conversation. There were small black boxes which were screwed to the walls, through which the staff could actually speak to one another, to the main office, and vice versa. One of these boxes was also installed in the house or residence of Gerald, so that he could be warned if such an occasion arose in case of an emergency, right? And then comes that the gorillas have got diarrhea. They are suffering from diarrhea. However, Npongo and Nandi grew apace, and to our relief developed none of the diseases that we feared they might contract. Okay, sepulchral essentially means a very mournful kind of a voice. Okay, so while all these were like warning signals, then came Npongo's first major illness. Okay, and that was the time when he had actually to travel to the south of France, Camargue, which is a region in France, where he had to be engaged in a television documentary for BBC. And then the hotels had been booked, and he was to travel, and there the only symptom at that time for Npongo was again acute diarrhea, and as we watched, his face seemed to shrink and shrivel, and his powerful body grew gaunt. So essentially it also shows that, you know, what happens, like human beings, he started losing weight, and that was not a very good sign from the point of view of the gorilla's health. And what had been a proudly rotund paunch, he was a very healthy kind of a gorilla, now became a ghastly declivity where his ribs forked, so you could actually see his ribs. Now his diarrhea was quite heavily tinged with blood, and at this symptom I almost gave up hope, that he thought they are going to give up on Npongo, that they were going to lose the gorilla. We felt that if he could eat something, we could give him something in order to kind of build up his stamina. And that's when Jackie and he went to the market in St. Helier and walked around the multicolored stalls, and there they decided that in addition to his normal diet, they would also buy a watermelon, which is not part of the normal diet of a gorilla, right? But they felt that he would be able to devour the watermelon. And they went that, and actually Npongo actually did that. He first drank the milk, and then they applied the Disprin on his gums. So look at the way they were almost trying to cheat him in order to medicate him, in order to ensure that he gets well pretty soon. So even though the watermelon contained no nutrition in that sense, but he had managed to acquire his interest in intake of food again, and that was a good sign, because once something went into his body, they would be able to medicate him, they would be able to give him some medicine, they would be able to administer him an antibiotic, because obviously you can't do that on an empty stomach. The consensus among the medical team was that he was suffering from a form of colitis, and the only way to get an antibiotic into him was through an injection, and thereby they enticed Npongo to come out of his cage and kept Nandi away from him. And while he was trying to be fed, he was fed with this watermelon. They injected the antibiotic onto him, and he didn't seem to have noticed anything. He followed us obediently into his cage, and with a small piece of watermelon retired to his shelf, where he curled up on his side. Now this person, Durrell, was in a quandary. He was in confusion whether he should undertake the journey with the BBC team, or should he kind of cancel it and hold on, because Npongo was not in the pink of health. And that kind of went on. He started drinking his Complan, a highly concentrated form of dried milk, and eating a variety of fruits, and by the evening he had actually shown signs of improvement, and that helped the author to actually undertake the journey to south of France. Npongo had drunk 1 pint of Complan and eaten 3 slices of watermelon, 2 bananas, 1 apricot, 3 apples and whites of 8 eggs, and therefore they felt there was no more cause for alarm. And by the time he returned from France after his BBC stint, Npongo had put on all the weight that he had lost, so his ribs could no longer be shown. And he greeted him his usual self, massive, black and rotten, his eyes glittering mischievously as he tried to inveigle me close enough to the wire so that he could pull on the buttons of my coat just like children would do. So he says something very important at the end of the story. He says it was of vital importance that they should be kept and bred in captivity. It was a two-edged sword. Why? Because for the anxiety you suffered when they became ill made you wonder why you started the whole thing in the first place. Because on one end you can say that, you know, they're endangered species, let them become extinct over a period of time, and the time could come pretty soon. But then you try to save them, you try to breed them in captivity so that, you know, the species lives on, you know, you acquire a mate for them, mate for the person, so that in that sense the future generation can be born. But then when you go through these kind of moments of anxiety, you wonder whether it's a double-edged sword, because you develop a sense of attachment, love and affection for the animal that you feel very aggrieved whenever they fall sick. So the last statement is important, because the problems are worth all the trouble that he goes through, because he's ensuring that an endangered species does not go completely extinct. Otherwise we would only be seeing the dinosaurs just like we see the dinosaurs in movies like Jurassic Park and Jurassic World. So the writing style, with the writing style that the author has, he develops the mood, and the entire story is told from his perspective. His perspective based on what he observes. Okay, and he's also critical of zoo managements, as I said, both of the political leadership as well as the zoo managements. And while writing on the gorilla, he is also making a larger point on the conservation of wildlife, especially that of the endangered species. The other interesting aspect about this particular story is the power equations between the two gorillas, and it's told narrated in a very interesting kind of manner. So the gist of this entire story is that it's not a dull documentary, because he's also telling you the story of two gorillas and about how the human being, especially that the author, the first person, deals and reacts and interacts with the two gorillas. So in that sense, that makes it a very engaging kind of a story. Also making the point that Npongo is not a specimen, he is an individual, right? In many senses very cute. And the line that I referred to, he then lifted a fat and gentle forefinger and investigated my beard. So those kind of lines actually tell you what kind of a gorilla he really is. So it's essentially a lot of infotainment, I would say, the manner in which this particular story is actually written. And the title, you would say, is a little misleading, because the bulk of the story is when he's in the zoo. The guest room is only a small part of the story, but I guess he used this particular title because it is a very catchy title. You wonder what's a gorilla doing in the guest room, right? You would not get a sense of what the story is all about just by reading the title. So in that sense, it kind of piques your curiosity. But having said that, the questions that you could get, as I said, the relationship between the narrator and Npongo, the power equation and the relationship between Nandi and Npongo, the manner in which, what kind of a wildlife story it is, and the last two lines and what they tell you about the entire story, that you could be asked to discuss the statement with reference to the entire story, whether how it is a two-edged sword. Okay, so those are some of the questions that you could come. So you would need to know the details of this particular story, use sufficient number of examples. Only if you do that, you will be able to score a 15 on 15 in this kind of a question. If you are able to do that, quote extensively from the story and use many of those examples to substantiate each of the point that you are trying to make in the answer. I hope this story is now very clear. It's a very delightful, witty, humorous and a very sensitively told story, and I would really hope that you choose this particular story to answer as far as your examination is concerned. Thank you very much for watching.